Welcome everyone. Today we have our another new episode. This is our 721 episodes, and I want to share a very good news. World Talent Economy Forum. We are collaborating with five different cities with 2 million people. So we will uplift the communities. Definitely, we have a lot of entrepreneurs in World Talent Economy Forum. So everybody gonna join and solve very different problem of the communities. And beside that, leadership is one of the important aspects. I think that everybody should learn. Definitely, governance is another issues. So today we have our world famous speaker, Mr. Eric, Dr. Talib Raphael, Mr. David Wood, Mr. David Smith. We have a very interesting entrepreneurs, and I think that he's trying to solve problem of emerging economy. We definitely want to invite him in Dhaka because we have lot of traffic jam. He can solve it. Mr. Mike, and we have our another world famous speaker, Mr. Rob. First, I would like to give chance, Mr. Eric.
Well, those are both great topics, leadership and governance. Some people argue about what leadership is. I always like the model that they said that, management, because they get confused, is doing things right, and leadership is doing the right thing. So what should we be working on? And what we should be working on and how we should be doing it, it is very changing in a disruptive technological society world that we live in today. Part of the fight is always between control and agility. If you can get everybody doing things exactly when at the right time, that works really good. But especially as you get big, then you aren't very agile because you have to wait. We did an analysis of trying to do better decision making and response, and we ended up breaking it up into different tasks, and we were trying to get seconds off, and in some cases that mattered, but we realized that some things took a 2-week approval. So the long pole in the tent in that leadership cycle was 2 weeks. So why are we trying to get seconds off of that piece of it? Doesn't make sense. So again, it depends what you're doing. And this becomes tied really into governance, especially as you try and take the advantage of network effects. So now we're building platforms where you're trying to get stakeholders, both providers and users and platform builders, this whole people working together. So we're trying to connect people as frictionlessly as possible to work together, to solve problems together. So how do you lead that? How do you lead when you have all these people? For example, let's say we get a platform that connects people with houses with people who want to rent in houses like Airbnb. So are you leading the housing owners? Are you leading the customers? Are you leading all the services and things that you're going to provide in that platform, or something like care.com, where you have people who want to do home care and home aids with people who need it? So who are you leading here? Are you leading the people that are going to provide the service to elderly in their homes? Are you going to lead the people that are home care providers themselves, or all the services like, billing and advertising, all the things in this platform? It becomes really a more complicated idea, which brings us to governance. One of the reasons these platforms succeed or fail is through governance. Without governance, we can do whatever we want, and there's all kinds of innovation, and that's a great thing. But then we're butting heads. If people think back to when they first started driving cars, there were no traffic rules. There were no stop signs. People were getting in accidents and going whichever way they want. Big cities, it didn't work well at all. And now you take that into the computer age, when you're trying to govern things like Microsoft or Android versus Apple. So Apple had all these rules, which meant things could could progress pretty seamlessly or more seamlessly. And on the other hand, you had people could write an app and put it in the Windows or Android framework, and what do you want? Well, I remember in the governance, all the people that are trying to do new things in the government would say, oh, Apple is so horrible, it's so locked down. And then the people in security would say, Apple is wonderful, it's so locked down. So it depends where you're going. So really, when we're talking about leadership and governance, is really understanding what we're trying to do, how we're going to influence this people. It's more difficult as we get decentralized and grow and build these platforms. And then the governance, as you start having different elements, which maybe you have no control over, part of that, how do you allow some in cases to govern themselves? For example, in the metaverse game of Alien Worlds, which is a good test. Basically, the citizens of the planet elect each other and run the game. So the game provider loses some control of what happens on the metaverse. So that's the same as what you're trying to do with distributed autonomous organizations now, where people are trying to come together and build these organizations, put leadership and governance for widely distributed stuff. So I think it's a matter of control and agility, and it's a matter of, is this a very tightly knit group, or is this a group of a lot of people coming together to accomplish something? So great topic. I look forward to hearing what others have to say.
Thank you. We have our great leaders, Dr. Talib Rafael. So, what do you want to share
Okay.
about leadership and
Now,
governance?
leadership and governance, both are different terms. Leadership has been as old with us for a long period of time throughout history. We had leaders there. We had different leaderships, especially in the developing world. But then governance is a new term. And like Eric said, governance is to do with technology now. Governance is not something that is easily understood by many people. It has to do with transparency. It has to do with agility. It has to do with so many other things. But leadership is something we understand very well. Now, leadership and governance together, how do they go together? The old and the new. They have to go together because leadership now cannot be provided without good governance. And governance needs to be good in order for leadership to survive. That's what I want to say at the moment. I was really interested in hearing what David and Rob have to say, and all the others, please. And I'll come back to me again. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Talib. Now I request Professor David Wood.
Well, thanks so much for the invitation to be here. Congratulations on reaching 721 episodes. I'm going to share my screen. I've got a few thoughts on here from the past of governance, the present of governance, and the future of governance. Let's start with the past. This is the governor that changed the world. In 1788, this was sometimes called the Watt governor that governed the engine that changed the world, the steam engine, which was relatively new in these early days, and it was quite dangerous. It would run too fast and overheat, and because of the fear of that and the fear of its dangers, it was often run slowly instead, not getting the most out of it. And then this invention, which connected the steam engine to this contraption, the governor. You can't see it in here, but there was a connection with the output of the steam engine making this crank go faster. And then because of this gearing mechanism, as that turned, this central pipe turned, what happens to these fly balls? Yes, they're going to move out. The faster it goes, the further they go out, and these levers adjust, and the result is the valve adjusts, so there's less fuel, and as the steam engine was starting to run too fast, it slows down again. So more generally, the governor allowed the steam engine to run better and made it a tremendous success. It wasn't the power of the engine, but it did carefully modulate its performance. Now, that's the past. Of course, I want to look today, and I want to talk about the most important governance problem, which is not governing the energy of the steam engine, but governing the remarkable energies, but the remarkable dangers of free markets. So looking 2023 and onwards, what most needs governance in this world? Two things. One, the development and deployment of new technologies, which could change the world even more than the steam engine, potentially cataclysmically. Or, if there is good governance, potentially producing wonderful public goods. I'm talking about the development and deployment of fast improving AI, but also the technologies of energy, biotech, finances, cognitive technologies, and so forth. The second aspect that needs governance isn't the creation of these technologies and the deployment, but the distribution of benefits arising from these new technologies. As I said, if there's good governance, there are potentially wonderful public goods arising, bountiful, clean energy, lots of food, lots of wealth. But in reality, there's lots of evidence that more powerful technologies are changing the economy and causing increased inequalities, joblessness, technological unemployment, technological underemployment, a precariat, people feeling alienated, left behind, lots of people dying earlier than expected. And this is even before COVID. And with the combination of people being resentful and access to weapons of mass destruction enabled by these technologies, we could have a cataclysm. This is serious stuff. So that's why it's my motto, as on one of my websites, it's time to take back control of technology. We can no longer just trust the well-meaning technology companies who say they are nice people, and surely they are run by nice people, but they're in a race which could have disastrous consequences. So how's this going to work? I want to talk now about leadership in governance. What does it mean to be a leader in this field? Well, first, it means drawing attention to what are the most important issues. That instead of our attention being spread over a whole number of interesting distractions, it is, as we heard from Eric, doing the right thing or paying attention to the right thing, which, as I've said, I believe is the development and deployment of powerful new technologies and the distribution of benefits arising from them. Historically, we've often said, leave it to the markets, leave it to the wage market, leave it to the capital markets, but there's enough evidence that these need more governance than before. Second, it's not just enough to draw attention, it's to build a sustained, constructive engagement. This means not just talking to people's intellect, it means raising their emotional connections as well, with credible, compelling scenarios of dangers and of profound benefits. It's tapping into fears, but also hopes in a realistic way. And leadership is not micromanagement, but it is setting the overall framework in which things happen. I have my own set of framework. It's the singularity principles you can find in my most recent book, and it talks about some of the things that the previous speakers have already mentioned, including agility, including transparency, including understanding the system rather than just somehow thinking this seems to work. That's no longer good enough. And finally, leadership is not micromanagement, but it's about having a vision of set of steps forwards. And if there's time later, I will talk again about what one of my websites, futuresearch.org, sets out as the way forwards, which is to work out realistic policies to turn around the risks of technological development and ensure it's for the benefit of everyone. And with that, I'll hand the mic back to you, Dr. Sharif.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor David Wood. Now I request Mr. David Smith.
Well, David did an excellent job beginning to lay out the whole framework, I mean, the differences, and Eric and Talib really helped set the stage. To me, leadership and governance are the yin and yang. You have to have them together. Is that, leadership is saying the vision, the goals, uh, getting the people aligned to going, but governance is saying, are we headed that direction? How are we doing? What are the elements of that we need to go through? And the role of governance really is to create, authorize, and monitor the strategic direction of the company, the enterprise, the nation, and as you begin to look at the leadership creates the value, the policy, and the plans that support uh, the delivery of those missions. So you can see they have to go really hand in hand to be uh, uh, functional there. And in today's time, it's very important for us to look about how do you sync up leadership? How do you sync up governance? Uh, During the early days of the COVID pandemic, uh, particularly as the lockdowns happened, as companies shut down offices and we began to move to work at home, as the education processes got turned upside down globally, uh, we really saw parts of this suffering. You know, a lot of the scholarly studies say that we lost not just the year and a half or 2 years of COVID for social and emotional learning, we've lost more than that because of the big gap. And leadership and governance depend a lot on the social and emotional learning of the people trying to implement and be guided by the principles here. Uh, the ability to govern, though, has so many different things in it because we've talked in the past that governance before was always usually defined to stovepipes, the narrow verticals of the company. But today, with the global environment, uh, the particularly disruptions in supply chains that we have, with conflicting regulations around the world, because most companies are global from their very launch, how you govern and how the governance is handled, not just within a leadership center or headquarters or others, but how it is distributed globally, is truly one of the challenges that we have to grasp with now. Governance is going through intense change in many organizations and is one that uh, much study and other work needs to be done to really quantify the nuances of the new government's paradigms. And I think that's one of the places where, Sharif, particularly as you look at the reach you have across the world with the World Talent Economic Forum, it's one that helping define these new governance and new governance structures and new government frameworks is one that this group is well suited to do. So, Sharif, I think that's my introductory remarks too.
Thank you, Mr. David Smith. Now I request Mr. Mike. He is an excellent entrepreneur. Leaders actually solves different problem of the emerging economy. That's why we create this World Talent Economy Forum. He has excellent experience. So, Mr. Mike, what you want to share with our audience?
Well, that governance and leadership is sort of outside of my domain. Mine is transportation, but I think what I have to say may be of interest. I look at sort of how the whole society is going towards a big brick wall in terms of being unsustainable, and I saw the analogy of like having the sustainable economy is like the Watt governor on steam engine, right? To be able to have the right amount of growth. And then related to the technology, what's interesting about the technology now, it's crossing a lot of political and geographic boundaries. And so you have these large vested companies that have enormous amounts of power, more than politicians and even countries sometimes, of being able to dictate how decisions and how governance is made, because they essentially can buy the laws that they want to be used to govern themselves. So we have this kind of a broken system as the governance is being influenced by money, and the status quo is very powerful because it has money, and so it can influence leadership because you can buy politicians, you can fund campaigns, you can get things done. And so these, I would call like trying to make good decisions, which is, I think, one of the fundamental underlying concepts of governance and leadership, is how do you make good decisions? And the trouble is we have all these, lots of issues, like all these negative externalities that are not being incorporated in these decision-making processes. You have corruption in the decision-making processes with money and power and status quo. You have misinformation, and you have echo chambers, and you have all this kind of people being able to be persuaded on bad information and not making good decisions based on that. And so is there a role of government? Well, you're trying to create fair markets and you're trying to look for the common good and support it. But it's very difficult. And democracy has seen its challenges. And I think there's other ways of, can we make good decision-making with, reason and especially there's an option of, like, with new cities and having charter cities and having perhaps different forms of government that we can try to test out and say which things are useful in this, and can we create a new charter for cities which has people are opting to, they move to the city because they like the charter for governance and for the leadership. And I'll just relate it to what we're doing, is that podways are essentially lower cost than roadways and are solving some of the key fundamental issues of how to build cities. I call them weapons of mass construction. Can we, instead of destroying the world, can we save the world with these weapons of mass construction and bring us to a point where we can have sustainable, livable cities and systems? So that's what I have to say for now.
Thank you. Mr. Rob.
Well, let's go back a little bit to kind of 101. I spent most of my undergraduate and graduate studies in management business. So there are actually three legs to the stool. We're mentioning two of them. Eric kind of drifted over to the third, which is important. So it's leadership, governance, and management. And to make it simple, let's say you've got a bunch of friends and you're going to go on a trip. One friend says, let's go to, I'm thinking Western culture, let's go to Disneyland. Everybody says, yeah, let's go to Disneyland. That's leadership. The leadership requires people to follow. It's setting a tactical or a strategic lead in a direction. Now somebody gets in behind the wheel of the car to drive. That's governance. The governance is the power to execute a particular strategy or tactic. And then management is making sure that you've got enough gas and the car is capable of getting there. In a company, you typically have the CEO owns leadership, and companies often fail because if you look at, for instance, Elon Musk and Twitter, I would say it's largely failing because there's a lack of leadership. Nobody wants to follow, nobody in Twitter really wants to follow Elon Musk. And that means leadership is lacking. In a typical company, the board has governance, and often the CEO and the board are kept different, though sometimes, and this is a bad practice, the CEO becomes the executive chairman, and then you've got governance and leadership in the same position. And the problem with that is, and the reason you want governance and leadership separate is because the people that have the power then are making sure that the leader doesn't self-deal, doesn't take the company in a wrong direction. Again, kind of pointing to the problem with Twitter, where that's fundamentally not working. You have governance vested in Elon Musk, who lacks leadership, and so the corrupting influence is on the controlling side, and that's going to be a problem. And then, of course, in the company, management is pretty much everybody else. You could point to the COO as being a kind of a center of management, but you could say the same thing about the head of accounting, the head of finance, the CMO, the CFO. Each one of them have a responsibility for managing the overall execution, making sure the company has enough money, enough people, and is able to fulfill the functions that the leader directs, and then the board assures the leader will fulfill. So you have those three legs, and if you're missing, if you're light in any of the three, the company will probably fail. You don't have the leadership, yeah. But Gerstner used to call the vision thing, the company won't advance. If you don't have good governance, the company is going to be like FTX, and it's going to go under largely for self-dealing or screw-ups. And of course, if you don't have management, it's going to run out of money. But best example I had of management was a head of marketing out of IBM taking over a company that sold restaurant equipment, and what he did is he decided, since he was out of sales, that the problem was they didn't have enough salespeople, and he increased the sales force by a massive number, and the company went out of business. So because it could one, none of those people knew how to sell the stuff, and number two, the overhead of all those salespeople just wiped out any profit the company had. There was a company who'd been in place for 30 years, and he took them out of business in about 12 months. So you need all three. You need competence in all three. You need strong leadership. You need the ship pointed in the right direction. You need governance. You need to make sure the person has the authority to do the right thing and is assured that the direction is the direction you want to go. And then you need people that are on the oars. They're actually making the ship happen, making sure that the people are fed. You've got plenty of gas and everything else. And with all three components adequately created, you have a viable company. And often when you see startups, they're missing any one of those three components. Often, though, it's with the startups, you have a vision. That's what created the startup in the first place. But governance may be vested in the leader, where you have problems and they overspend, they overdirect, they self-deal or whatever, and the company goes under. And then finally, you have issues where you may miss staff. Often when you're going into a new business, a new concept or whatever, leadership doesn't know what they need. And so invariably they staff inefficiently. You have people doing jobs that don't know what they're doing, or you've left jobs that are critical to the success of the company unfilled, and the end result is they're going to fail. So you need all three legs of the stool need to be solid, need to be well represented. Otherwise, the stool will fall over. In this case, the company or government will fail. You often find in government, by the way, even though we talk about governance, we find in governments that they can be lacking significantly in any one of those three areas. Somebody gets elected to a position, they get the power to do something, so they have governance, but nobody wants to follow them. We've got a politician here in the United States who's apparently a walking fictional character. There's nobody in the world that's going to follow him. So he's got the job, he's got governance, but he lacks leadership and will be ineffective in the underlying role. And then often you get people that lack the underlying skills to do the job, that get elected into offices, and that means that they have no ability to execute. Their management side is weak. So all three legs need to be solid. Otherwise, the stool will fall over or the position will fail.
Thank you, Mr. Rob. Now I request Mr. Eric.
The real challenge with leadership is what are we leading for, and who decides? If you have a company, do the stockholders decide what we're trying to accomplish? Do our customers decide? So that's the real challenge. Is the agency problem is when what the management that you hire to do the company thinks is the right thing is different from the owners, because there's some moral hazards and some conflicts in what's best interest. For example, a leader may be focused on how do we get our bonuses, which may not be in the interest of the workers or even the owners. So there's always that conflict and challenge of saying, well, what are we leading toward? What are we trying to lead to here? That's why really a strong leader is important. A good leader, somebody that can cut through all that and make it clear to everybody, hey, here's really what we should be doing. And like Rob said, get everybody to follow on that right direction. That's the first challenge today, especially as we get these networks, like social networks, where there's a bunch of people trying to figure out where to go with different opinions. How do you get, the Martin Luther King idea of getting everybody across lines to start moving in the same direction with the same belief? But let's say we have that. Let's say let's say David and his future Surge got us in there and we've got a plan and we like it and we're all going there. Well, we still have to figure out how we're going to interact with each other and what we're going to use. So what are the problems with governance, which is coming up with and implementing the rules efficiently and effectively? The first problem is, take like governance of the countries, is people resist change. Like right now, if you ask in the US government, most people would agree that we need some change, even at the constitutional level. However, almost nobody will agree that they can trust our leaders to do that. So there's resistance to change because change requires risk. And if you don't trust the people to implement that change, then change doesn't occur because we don't trust each other. So trust is a big part of that equation. The other thing, though, that's a problem is the incumbents have a big advantage. We've seen this a lot of time, like there was a gaming environment where everybody was creating games, and what happened? All of a sudden, the top 5 or then 2, then 3, the gaming players, suddenly every money coming to that. We've seen that in direct sales, where all of a sudden the rules keep changing to benefit those people who got more power. So there's a big incumbent advantage that's very tough in governance. One of the other problems with governance is that people come with governance with different levels of knowledge. For example, if we are here going to make decisions together and vote for people on, how to do open heart surgery, this probably isn't the best group. On the other hand, if the topic is transportation, then I think we would agree that Mike has an advantage here that we should be talking about. But in general, when groups have come together, there's all different levels of knowledge. So your government has to take into account that not everybody's coming with the same level, especially when you try and govern politically. People, there are people that don't listen to any information, or they only listen to one biased source of information. So we've got different types of information. But probably the biggest problem in governance is that some small group of people is going to understand what's going on better than others and take advantage and end up getting control. So that's often what happens, is the desire of a small group of people to control. We've seen that with blockchain. A block starts, it's supposed to be a bunch of people under common leadership coming together in a fair and transparent environment, and yet somebody figures out, and all of a sudden a few different people are controlling the block. So what happens is somebody goes and forms another block, and they put in rules, governance, to make sure what happened the first time doesn't happen again. And guess what? Somebody figures out something else, and then they do it again. Somebody figures out something else. So the biggest challenge in governance is a few people always want to take controls, and then they make the rules to benefit whatever it is they're doing. You see this within companies where division or group. You see this with Microsoft, where the Microsoft, the people doing the Office software had much more power than anybody else doing things like SharePoint or anything else in there. And the whole structure was meant so that it benefited this one group of people because they pretty much were making the rules. So governance is really challenging, especially when a bunch of people come together. If you're talking about the book Network States, it talks about people coming together for some common purpose, building networks that are almost like governance. And then how do you manage that group of people coming together and making decisions together? It's very challenging. So when we look at governance, we have to realize there's a lot of problems with governing, even deciding who to govern, because we have different motivations, and there's a desire among most people. Even if you're trying to do it for altruistic reasons, you think, I must be right. So you see that in U.S. politics. I must be right, so we need to control to make sure that the right things happen because we don't believe the other people. So governance is tough.
A very quick follow-up, Eric. You mentioned the book Network State by Balaji Srinivasan, which seems like a lot of nonsense to me, but I wonder if you've actually looked into it and you would recommend that I pay more attention to it.
Yes, you should, because one of the big tenets of that book is that people used to turn to religion for guidance, and then they turned to government, and now people aren't trusting governments, so they're looking for other sources to who they follow. So, if you look, more people spend time with their networks than with anything else. And I think that, at least from that book, is a valid point. Is there's a bunch of people that are either locked to Fox News in the U.S. or MSNBC, and their networks become more powerful than even the government. And if you look, in politics, you've got in the U.S. Republicans and Democrats, and people spend more time focusing on their party than on the governance. So what happens when somebody gets an idea to do something, they start coming together, then you start listening to that. So that becomes a point of leadership to, regardless if you believe. But I think it has some very valid points in there, in that people are saying, well, I don't trust other people, so I'm going to hang out with the people I trust, and we're going to move ahead. For example, if we follow Sharif and he says, let's do this, and we all kind of come together, then this becomes its own leadership and governing force that actually gets things done. And some of these network states are getting things done. They're buying things, they're doing things. So if you look at the growth of them, I think that's at least something to put in your, something you should keep looking at.
Thank you. Now I request Dr. Talib.
Okay. Now, I've listened very carefully to all what is being said. It's all very valuable. But I think that just to finish on what Rob finished with, the three-legged thing, I think leadership is the most important part there. Leadership can and should be able to manage all governance rules. And leadership should be able to bring us together. That's good leadership. I'm thinking about governments now, not about companies. In governments, leadership is very important. Now, leadership is something that cannot be equated to anything else, because a good leader, must be good in governance, must be good in management as well. That's a good leader. Otherwise, people won't trust him. If people don't trust this person, he's not a leader anymore. So I want to just say that leadership is more important than governance now. Leadership has been a concept that's been with us for as long as history is there. And leadership is still one thing that we should all rally around. I think that's very important, especially in the developing world. Leadership is what we lack, because without leadership, we cannot have good governance, we cannot have good management, Rob. I think so. Thank you.
I don't think that good leaders necessarily need to be good managers, but they have to understand the importance of managers. Like I don't think Martin Luther King was that great of a manager, but he had one. I think that's important. Is if you're a great manager, but you're not a good leader, you need to find somebody good at leadership. I think you need to have
you
those
need to be
things.
You need to be a good leader. You need to be a good leader to recognize that. You need to be a good leader to recognize that. So leadership
I think
is
whoever you are,
important.
you need to recognize those things are important and bring them together somewhere, whether you're a good manager or a good governance or good at leadership. Yeah, all 3 points are important.
How about the most important role of leadership is establishing good governance and good management?
Yes. Good leaders are supposed to do that. People are expecting them to do that. That's what I'm trying to say here. Leadership is very important in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. David Wood.
So I've got some questions for some of my colleagues, perhaps. So a question for you, Mike. I was very interested in your discussion of possible new models that democracy may not be so successful. We've seen the problems with democracy. We've seen that it's got log jammed. We've seen that sometimes the strange conclusions are being reached. And you mentioned possible alternative models with which reason would have more of a say. What do you have in mind there, so that we can have a more sensible governance environment rather than living in a dysfunctional, broken governance environment?
Well, one of my advisors, Christopher Fry, is from MIT, and they actually have a class on why can't we just get along? And they wrote a book about all the different aspects. It covers from governance and justice and economics. And so it was establishing this notion of a reasonocracy, that you could have good decision-making tools and actually teach people how to make good decisions, where it's not really the democracy or votocracy, but the purpose was how to get good decision-making. And so, like, for example, like I don't know how much this matches, but like in Singapore, there's a leadership that established good governance and management that could take it from a developing country to one of the top economies in the world in a very short period of time. And so you could argue that it was leadership initially, but you have to sort of, as a leader, you have to make those decisions to establish how to move beyond your personal leadership and how to move beyond you as an individual and encode that in the decision-making process. So I can send a link to that. Yeah, why can't we all...
Reasonocracy sounds like a great word. I'm going to look that up. Reasonocracy. And Singapore clearly did a lot of things right, haven't they? I think because they promoted people who understood actual things. They weren't just lawyers. I'm not against lawyers. Lawyers are very important, but they had domain experts running their relevant departments rather than just happen to be the nephew of your friend.
Right, because
well, Singapore also had a strong motivation and a clear, they had to survive without reason. So how does a company survive without any natural resources? And they did a good job of that. But another important thing is you need the right leader for the right time. There's plenty of startup companies that had a great leader to get it going, but failed when the company because there's a big difference between creating a company, and growing a company and operating a big company. You can take Uber as an example of, you have to have the right leader at the right time. And sometimes it's hard for leaders to turn it over to another leader when needed.
Yeah. But right now, we're not talking about the survivability of individual businesses. We're talking about the survival of humanity. And can government make the right decisions where you have to think about more of the common good or we will all perish? So how does that happen and how does that impact things? It's like we're just not making good decisions. We're being influenced by the wrong situations.
And I would still argue the right leader for the right time. Take Winston Churchill in England. They needed that kind of leader at the right time.
Yeah. So we're talking about Greta, it's
Well, and there's many different types of leaders too that can be appropriate for different parts of the process. So it's really a hard question there. Well, Sharif, you brought up one of my graphics. Do you want me to talk about that?
Yes.
Well, when I was beginning to look a little bit more about the governance side of this, and Sharif often asks us to talk about how does this work in developed versus developing nations? How does it work in business? How does it work in the other sides of it? This is a great chart that I have used in the past of how do you look at governance in an international context today. And as many of you know, I'm a firm believer in group intelligence and collaboration, where you see that at the part of this. And you've often heard me talk about technopolis. And the technopolis is a very important concept when you take leadership and governance and you apply that to regions of the world. The technopolis concept is what helped make Austin, Texas, where I live, into more of a technology leader today than it was when I moved here way back in the 70s. But you begin to see places here where business, the private companies, the industries, the associations and others have to come together with the government, with whether it's a national government, parliament, regional, local government, and the other agencies. But particularly in leadership and governance in developing nation, the third sector is very, very important as well, where you have the non-government organizations, the foundations, the think tanks, the world bodies, you have research institutions. If you look at things like the World Bank, the International Development Bank, even things like USAID, which is an extension of the US government, really. for leadership and governance to come together in developing nations, you've got to have this collaborative fabric put in place there. And Mike, I love what you're saying, the time for leadership right now, but it's also a time of collaborative leadership, because it's true in the developed nations 1,000%, but globally in the developing nations and where today, everything, if you've heard me speak on these before, you know, I talk fairly often about how everything is a system of systems. And because it is a system of systems, the way you lead, the way you govern, the way you have interactions, even the way you look at simple things like security, well-being, and others have to be treated different when I'm in a system of systems and when I'm in a vertical stovepipe. And a lot of government, as you were talking about, was designed for those vertical stovepipes, and not to live in a globally interconnected world where everything has become systems of systems. And that's part of what I said earlier, where governance has to change, is because we have to understand that the complexity is ruled more now. I almost see as having to put really courses together, particularly for leadership and governance, on how do you do these in a world where complexity theory, chaos theory, and wicked problems are the norm rather than the exception. And as I look at it, and as this complex system problem, these are two of the key critical elements we as a society, we as leaders of companies, we as leaders of countries, we have to grasp with these, because they've changed dramatically and they're continuing to change. And as we look at how we're going to have to put these in place in times where, because of regenerative healthcare and other things, our specter for leadership, our specter for governance is getting longer and longer with fewer and fewer resources. All of that have to come into play with this too. So Sharif, really thank you for this. I was actually more trying to answer a question than actually get into this, but that is clearly where I kind of see some of the differences, is that we do live in a complex world governed by complexity theory, governed by systems of systems, and we have not updated our institutions, and governance is an institution. We have not updated our institutions to be able to survive and thrive in this type of an environment. So Sharif, thank you.
So David, I
Thank
want
you.
to ask you then, who would you point to as the great leader in the current time, given the analysis you've provided? Or is your answer, in fact, that it's not a matter of individual leaders, it's a matter of getting the architecture right? And if the architecture is right, then we will thrive
David,
more
I
with leaders.
think it's a matter of getting the collaboration correct, the intelligence correct. You know, we realize, if I look back in history, that relationships and people coming together oftentimes is what made the difference, and leaders were just the people who could marshal that group intelligence together, who could marshal those collaborative activities together. And you go back and look at that time and time. This is, for people in the United States, this is maybe controversial, but if I go back to when Ronald Reagan was president, Ronald Reagan was not a great leader, but Ronald Reagan did a very good job of pulling the collaborative intelligence together and beginning to work the collaboration that gave you the ability to collaborate, not linear, but to the log. For us to really truly advance, we have to change our ways we do this from a linear process to a logarithmic process, because the challenges globally are such that you have to go to that steeper curve to be successful today. So do I have a great leader today? No, there's leaders with some great characteristics, but there's not a complete great leader today, in my opinion. But what I'm seeing is I'm seeing leaders pull together great collaborations and making a difference. So I hope that answered your question, Dave.
Yeah. Mr.
Mike,
Mike,
you're on.
you have to unmute yourself.
When we talk about leadership, are we all referring to ethical leadership? Because there's lots of great leaders that got millions of people to follow them that were unethical. So are we sort of assuming that leadership should imply that it's actually good leadership and not towards us, an evil leadership?
Well, my question was, who is the most admirable leader in the world today? The ones that we wish there were more people like that, the wish maybe we could become like that, or that we should promote people like that. And that includes the relevant ethics as well. When I might point to people like Satya Nadella or Sundar Pichai, they're both sort of level 5 leaders in the terminology of Jim Collins. They don't stamp their authority and personality and charisma, but they get organizations working very well together. So they might be among the best leaders in at least the business field. I'm not sure about the political field.
Yeah, I think that a lot of those, the best leaders, we don't even know about because their job is making sure everybody else is successful. And so we don't hear about them. There's a lot of leaders like Lee Iacocca, who is in the news all the time, who got things done, but it was pretty much about Lee, where I think your point, David, is right on, that we don't know a lot of the great leaders because it's not about them.
Yeah, I mean, maybe one example is the Prime Minister of New Zealand, who just resigned. She was one of the youngest leaders. She implemented a lot of changes. She made a lot of great decisions, and then said, "You know what? Family's important, so I'm going to bow out." That's,
yep,
that brings up high in my book.
Leaders must gain the trust of people.
Yeah, I would add the Prime Minister of Finland to that. If I were going to point to two politicians that were excellent leaders, I would point to New Zealand and Finland probably as where where that example is in place. And with Belarus, you've got governance without leadership. In fact, in looking at Russia, and I would argue that the jailed opponent, excuse me for the pronunciation of Navalny, is probably the strongest leader in Russia, but governance resides in Putin. And that kind of showcases what happens when you have an imbalance and where the person that has the power isn't behaving ethically. And the war in Ukraine is an example of horrid management. So that management's completely out of control. And that's what happens when you get bad governance. Everything else breaks. So I disagree with Talib as far as leadership being the most important part. Each one of these things are equally important. I don't view any one as more important than the other, because if you have an automobile, you might argue that the engine is more difficult than the tires. But if you don't have tires on the car, it's not going very far. You don't have gas in the car, it's not going very far either. So each of those elements is critical to the automobile, just as leadership, management, and governance are as important to any operating body. Now, the reason why leadership and governance often should be separate, and you have that in many political systems, where in the United States, the president and Congress are separate bodies. You argue governance resides with Congress, leadership resides with the executive office, and so the one is supposed to keep the other honest. But if either one of those goes completely off the rails, you're going to have serious problems. And of course, if nobody can manage, you've got issues. If you look at Apple, Tim Cook is probably one of the strongest managers that company's ever had, but he's nowhere near the leader that Steve Jobs was. So again, and don't get me wrong, it's doing well. Microsoft under Steve Ballmer, strong management skills, no doubt. The excellent manager, but not the leader that Bill Gates was. And so in the end, for excellence, you need all three. In fact, often in a company, where governance generally resides with the board. And when you have a problem, it is the board that's supposed to step in and correct the underlying problem. When IBM nearly went under, the board stepped in. And interestingly, they actually appointed a new CFO first to solve the management problem initially. And then they appointed Lou Gerstner as the CEO to run it. And we could certainly argue that Gerstner was much more of a manager than he was a leader, at least in the computing space, because he didn't know the technology. And that's often the issue with companies that hire CEOs from outside. They get somebody that is strong in management, but they don't know the source material, and so they suck at leadership. They might have been great leaders at their prior company because they were a subject matter expert. So Gerstner was certainly a subject matter expert when it came to marketing out of Nabisco, but he couldn't figure out a floppy drive to save his life, which was the rolling joke when I was there with him in IBM. So the end result is his vision. He couldn't come up with a vision, which is critical to a leader because you're supposed to set the direction for the firm, because he had no idea what the company could do. In fact, he had no idea what the company did, which was problematic. But what the company needed fixed to keep the doors open was it needed the management side fixed because that had gone off the rails. And so bringing in a CEO that could help fix management after the CFO that was directed to fix management, the two of them together got IBM so it wasn't going under anymore. And then they could bring back in a leader hired from inside, Sam Palmisano, to run the company and actually provide the strategy the company needed to go forward. But if the company was just going under because it was burning money, it doesn't matter how great the leader is, because you're going to run out of money before you can even point the company in the right direction. And so the board, which contained governance, was the one that stepped in and carried the heavy load. And so in that example, you'd argue in that situation, governance was the most important aspect of the model, because without strong governance, the other two things would not have occurred. But in an ongoing business, each one those little alarms behind your proximity alarms indicating that somebody just came to the house. But but you need all three. All three have to be strong. All three have to be capable. Once you start talking about one of the legs being stronger than any of the other two, you're missing the point. It's because all three. It's like arguing the structure of the house is more important than the foundation. No. You need both. If you have a crappy foundation, the house will fail. If you have a crappy structure, the house will fail. You need both to make the structure work. And with any type of operating unit, you need leadership, governance, and management, and all of them have to be competent. Any one of them being incompetent will sink the company. And same thing in government. It doesn't matter if the king or whatever is a fantastic leader. If the rest of the nation can't execute, or if the leader lacks power, if the earls decide to revolt, and typically in a monarchy, the king owns the leadership, but most of the people are owned by the folks that are underneath him. If any one of those areas fails, the government fails, and so you need all three. All three are equally important. All three are critical. At any given time, any one of those units can step in and cover for a short period of time for the other two, but on a sustained basis, you need balance and you need competence, and to a certain extent, you need honesty and integrity that covers all three groups. You can't have a crooked leader and integrity in the board. Not going to work. You can't have a great leader and have a lack of integrity in the board. That won't work. You can't have great board and great leader and the rest of the company all be crooks. Won't work. So in the end, you need all three. All three have to be equally important. And when you're building a company, honestly, the first leader you get, the first CEO you get, does need competence in all three areas. They need to understand management. They need to understand governance, because that first leader is the one that has to set up the initial mechanism. And if they do it wrong, if they create a board that just says yes to whatever they say, for whatever they introduce, or they don't know how to select a staff, the company's not going to go anyplace. So the one time when a leader is the most important is in the foundation of something, because then you need.
I call him a benevolent dictator. You need the power. What? You need the power of a benevolent dictator.
Yeah, you need
the benevolent dictators often
has to know what they're doing.
Yeah, benevolent dictators often go south unless there's a framework around them to constrain them.
Exactly
So
right.
I'm with Rob. I think this is a complex situation, and we shouldn't oversimplify it. Separation of powers is one of the most important aspects of a successful democracy. And when we dismantle the separation of powers, when we take the teeth away from the judiciary or from the media or from the academics, then it makes the society worse.
Yeah.
Even governance is not just a single thing. You can't say governance is all about agility. Governance is all about transparency. Unfortunately, we have to get a lot of things right. But hey, there's
All
a
of
lot
the
of
above.
us.
Yeah, no, it's funny. It's often when you look at a management problem, people look at something that is all of the above and take it like multiple choice. Well, I don't really want to do that part. I don't really want to do this part, and it's going to fail. You've got to do all of it. These aren't multiple choice problems. These are all of the above problems.
But the problem is bootstrapping. If you have to roll a Yahtzee in order to get everything set, what is the key thing where then you can set all the others in motion? So yes, all three may be important, but is there a way to bootstrap where you can just sort of luck out on one aspect and be able to create everything else?
Initially, vision is probably the most important aspect. If you don't have vision at the beginning of a firm,
vision is something that leadership must be acquired.
Exactly right. That's at the very beginning. Vision and leadership. I will agree. Vision, leadership at the very start is critical. But once you've got a going concern, all three elements have to be in place.
Okay.
Thank you. I have to go for the concluding remarks for today's session. Yes.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yes.
Dr. Sharif. No, go ahead, Dr. Sharif. Go ahead.
Yeah, Dr. Talib, what you want to add?
I want to say that leadership means the trust of people. The trust of the crowds has to be there. And if the trust is not there, there is no leaders. And I agree with Eric that it's a manipulative dictator sometimes. Leaders are dictators. Good leaders are dictators. But how do they work in a democratic environment? That's something that most of the leaders don't know how to do. But leaders today have to do that. Now it's all about leaders, Rob. I'm sorry to say this again. Leaders must have vision. They must have a good management. And they must know how to select the right people around them. Now the right people would do the jobs that you are acquiring to do. But it's a leader that matters. At the center of things is the leadership. That's what I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Eric, what's your concluding remarks?
Well, I think it's less about having a leader and more about leadership through whole organization, because there's not one leader, there's lots of leaders. And I think one of the tasks of a good leader is to make sure to acquire, train, develop great leaders throughout an organization. The second thing that's happening is this idea of leading. When you deal with a disruptive environment, leadership has to be all over the place between groups that are changing and adapting. So that's not true with everything, but with so many things, there's an agility required. And to the point that even if you look at distributed autonomous organizations and things like that, a lot of those functions of management and all that get migrated to, the cloud or the block. But there's even cases where people are now setting up the governance first. And one of the purposes of the governance is to select that good leadership in a way where people don't take control. So, but it's very challenging that you're always going to be fighting the tendency of a tyranny of the minority over a majority, or the tyranny of a majority over the minority. So that's always a big task. So, but I agree with Rob's point. Leadership management and governance, absolutely critical, especially I think even today governance is a more challenging and bigger role, because when you get that leadership and that management distributed over lots of different pieces, it's very hard.
Thank you. Mr. David, what's
Leadership,
your concluding remarks?
we said, is about doing the right thing. There's so many issues and topics we've covered. there are many others we're going to be distracted with as soon as we stop this meeting and go into the rest of the stuff. How do we really understand the things that deserve our attention more than anything else? And I think it comes down to what's also been said by, I think, David Smith. We need a systems analysis. You know, we could easily get preoccupied by one point without seeing all the connections, and it's worth taking the time to explore our understanding of how all these things fit together. My own analysis of what lies at the bottom, the three most important things to change are education, politics, and vision. We need to be sure that more people are learning the most vital skills. We need to be transforming our politics so that it's much more of a reasonocracy, I like that word, instead of a partisan conflict. And ultimately, this will be driven by a powerful, credible vision of what a better world could be like, and also what a terrible state we might get into if we are distracted. So that's what I put at the top of my hierarchy: education, politics, and vision.
Thank you. Mr. David Smith?
I think David may be in another
Mr.
meeting
David,
just
can you
now.
unmute yourself?
Unmute yourself, David.
He's in another discussion, I think.
I think he's on another call.
Okay, Mr. Mike, what's your concluding remarks for today's session?
That the reason why we have three legs and why we have a balance of powers is to make better decisions. So and don't necessarily limit ourselves, because leader is not necessarily leadership, governor is not necessarily is governance, that it's really about making good decisions. That's what we have to do. That's what we need the systems in place to establish that, and that we should be open for ways of how do we get to better decision-making processes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Mr. David Smith?
Well, Sharif, thank you. I almost don't know what I can add to the discussion that we've had so far. Leadership and governance are important today. They're important in actually our individual lives. They're important in our companies. They're important in our countries, and they're important in the global environment. And as I said before, I believe we're going through a time where we're seeing particularly governance change and how leadership must interact to it. We saw during the pandemics that leadership had to change to adapt to that dynamic situation. And I believe we're going to continue to see that going forward in the future. Thank you for hosting and leading this vitally important discussion we've had today. And thank you for allowing me to be part of it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Law.
So I spent a lot of time as an internal auditor going in and fixing things that were broken. We had a field audit for one of IBM's divisions, and often what I've found when I've gone and looked at an operational unit is really bad things occur when you mix leadership and governance and put it into the same person. Carly Fiorina at HP, for instance, comes to mind. Whenever you see a company that's got an executive chairman, that means that governance, that board has been subordinated to the CEO, and governance and leadership are contained within that role. And often that's why the company has gone off the rails. You get it's a power corrupts absolute, power corrupts absolutely. When you give any individual that kind of power, invariably they're going to make a mistake. And governance is supposed to make sure that those mistakes don't occur. And when you've got the same person that is both the leader and has the total authority of the board, so owns governance as well, you're eventually going to have some serious problems. And they may be ethical, they may be operational, they may be problems of focus. But you're going to have serious problems. And so separating those two things becomes critical for the sustained function of the firm. I would argue that any leader of any company, if they don't understand management, I don't know how they got there. So you need to understand management, but governance needs to be separate. And your ideal leader is probably somebody that's performed in all three roles. You can't run a company unless you've actually managed someplace, somehow. Because you won't have the right skills, and if you don't understand governance, you're likely to do something stupid like take over governance, subordinate the board, and end up costing you your job. HP kind of had a series of CEOs come through as executive chairmen, and they all failed pretty much catastrophically, being fired in the job. And that's not uncommon when you have a CEO that's an executive chairman. Invariably, their ending is catastrophic, and not in their best interest, and often the company fails. And so in the end, I'll just once again, you need all three legs of that stool. You need strong governance that has to be separate from leadership, and you need management, and that goes to that idea of that we be pushing back a bit on that idea of a benevolent dictator, because a dictator has governance and leadership contained in the same person, and you can certainly see a benevolent dictator initially is very efficient, highly efficient. I can get amazing things done, and then invariably they go off the rails because they have no control. And so the very things that made them great, Hitler, for instance, if you studied Hitler up through the 1930s, he was considered a pretty decent guy, and then he went off the rails insanely, almost destroyed the entire country. Governance and leadership in the same person, really a bad idea. So keep the elements separate. That assures the sustained function of the unit. And if for efficiency you decide to combine them, realize that you better uncombine them after that particular problem's over. Otherwise, that same mechanism that you created will kill the effort. It's kind of like triage in medicine. Triage has a point. There are instances where you need triage, but if you look at how GE was managed after Welch left, they stayed in triage mode, and eventually the company got into real trouble again. So in the end, all three things in balance. Sometimes you can get away with unbalancing them for short periods of time to solve a problem, but that is not the way to sustain a business.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. This is excellent discussion. Specifically for the emerging economy, we have a challenge and problem with the leadership. Definitely good governance is another important thing. World Talent Economy Forum always organize dialogue based on the local demand. I can remember last week we organized corporate training, and we do case study on different corporations in India and Bangladesh, and we find that leadership in crisis. So hopefully today's session will be helpful for our corporate leaders, those who want to learn more about leadership and governance. And beside that, that World Talent Economy Forum take more action. We not only organize these dialogues, we do more research work, we build up projects. We are working with Gujarat Chamber of Commerce. We are working with different cities of Bangladesh right now. Specifically right now, we are very active in South Asia. So the entrepreneur, those who want to solve the emerging economy problems, they can join in our team and take real actions. Already around 2 million people, cities, they collaborate with World Talent Economy Forum, and we are uplifting these 2 million people in Bangladesh and in India. Thank you everyone for joining today's sessions. We just finished our 721 episode. Hopefully your contribution can uplift more community and can solve more social and economical problem. Thank you. Bye-bye and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.